We got Albert's in here, John, Deborah, Mike, Kelly. Good to see all you guys. Thanks for coming
Thanks
today.
for joining, for sure.
It's 12:05. Let's start. Again, to everybody that's here, my name's Carl Kaiser. I'm a digital marketing specialist at Integris. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation. If we can, we'll get to them. If not, we're going to save them to the end and we'll do our best to answer everybody. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony and Kris, and I'm going to leave the stage.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl, for setting us up for success here and putting this together for us. Welcome, everybody. We got folks from all across the nation joining us today. Kris and I are going to go across a concept called responsible IT architecture. The title of this is a no-nonsense approach to foundational IT best practices. So with that quick agenda, we're going to do intros for myself and for Kris. We'll get into the main discussion, and then we'll do Q&A. As Carl mentioned, that chat is wide open. I am going to do my best throughout the presentation to constantly take a look at it. I'm sure there will be questions that come up on specific topics. If they're in line with that topic, I will try to ask our subject matter expert, Kris, here, the question in real time. If I don't get to your question in real time, I promise to get to it in our Q&A session. With that, my name is Anthony DeGraw. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Integris. Integris is a nationwide managed IT service provider with a focus on deep cybersecurity and compliance organizations. We've grown rapidly over the last couple of years and currently across 3 different time zones and have over 650 folks on our team now. Kris and I are extremely excited with what we've all been able to do together and the team's capabilities. And this is just a continuation of that, of what they bring to the table every single day to service our over 1,800 clients. I got my background before Integris. I was in the commercial insurance space, specifically focused on cybersecurity and liability insurance, working with large financial institutions, publicly traded companies, healthcare organizations, and colleges and universities, understanding that legal language behind the scenes on the cyber insurance policies and when they kicked in to place and what coverage they provided. In my fight to continue to win the cybersecurity war, I decided to make the switch over to the proactive side and join up with Kris and team to implement the best practices, the things we're going to be talking about today to prevent these breaches or incidents from ever even happening. With that, Kris, turn it over to you for a quick intro, and then we'll get into it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Anthony. Kris Laskarzewski, Chief Product Officer here at Integris. Been with Integris for 12 years right now, and been working with Anthony for close to 6 years to shape and provide best-in-class managed IT services to our clients.
Awesome. Let's get into it. So we're going to start real quick on a little rant from myself. And Kris hopefully will back me up on the importance of foundational practices. As Kris mentioned, we've been doing this together now for approximately 6 years. We've probably each assessed about 1,000 different networks together, both in person and virtually, all across this country. And what happened over time, or how we got to this eventual framework and concept, was a lot of times presenting back that data and companies just having no idea where to even start and being caught completely off guard. Kris has a little story. Actually, he did it on his LinkedIn this morning, little story about how this kind of came together. But the basic answer is, how do we start to educate folks on the best practices, those foundational items that just need to be in place in 2023? At this day and age, there's just no reason for them not to be in place. And a lot of times we are the organization that's coming in, and it could be due to bad service, or it could be due to no strategy. But when we come into those environments and we get our hands dirty, these things are consistently persistent in our findings and in gaps of the different vulnerabilities that exist. So this framework was put together by Kris and his team to make sure that we could now educate, not only from a marketing perspective like we're doing today, but also for our entire sales force as they go out and talk with businesses of all sizes every single day to make sure they understood what they need to be doing. Whether it's Integris or not, we don't care. We want to better the world, these companies, make them safer and keep them in business. Kris, any thoughts on the foundational practices?
Yeah, one other way to talk about this, Anthony, and you hear me speaking about this a lot, is I think about this almost like the seatbelts of IT. You get in the car, you're going to put the seatbelt on. You have all kinds of fancy lights on the dash right now telling you have to put the seatbelt on. This is what are we telling our clients, our audience here today, that this is your seatbelt to put on in order to stay safe in the connected world.
Absolutely. And it's not voluntary anymore, right? These are, as you think about a seatbelt, you should think about these in the same use case. So before we get into the framework, we kind of wanted to talk through two different use cases. So business A and business B. So I'm going to start with business B, the worst case scenario. Last year, we did a couple cyber insurance webinars and compared this same thought process against different policyholders. Here, we're going to do it today on what they're faced with. B being the worst case scenario here, they're always behind the 8 ball. And whether they're in a compliance industry or not dealing with regulators, the sense here is that they're behind and they're constantly reacting to situations. And as we all know, whether that's in our personal life or in our business life, it's never good to be reacting to situations. It's better to be prepared for them. They're constantly facing unexpected downtime or outages. I like to say this as they're constantly in the emergency room. Right? It's not the best way to deliver medical care. It's also not the right way to be handling IT and cybersecurity. Finally, unplanned cost and increases. I can't tell you how many times Kris and I and our teammates that are probably on this call now have had to go into a business after an assessment that we've done and have to tell them that they're looking at $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 in an investment to get their network just up to this standard. As Kris mentioned, we're just talking about seatbelts. We're not talking about the ability to change lanes without your hands on the wheel. We're talking about seatbelts, and the look of despair on these business owners' faces or on their executive team, it's terrible. And we've had to have this conversation many of times, and it never gets easier. And what we've seen over this time is that if they took that dollar amount, let's use it 100,000, and the last time they invested in their network was 10 years ago, if you take that amount and divide it by the number of years they haven't done anything, it's really not that big of a number, and it's way more predictable. But the problem is they implement things and then never think about it again until A and B happen, the emergencies happen. And then finally, it's not scalable. Think about the quick changes that had to happen just with the COVID epidemic that happened in 2020 and 2021. How many businesses were completely caught off guard? And it's because they were still running systems like they were the 90s or 2000s, right? They'd never adjusted. For companies that are constantly pushing the envelope or just following a determined path, their ability to change course in that type of incident was a lot easier. Not that it wasn't completely unpainful, it was still a little bit, but their path was really good. Quick story on that, actually, this just reminded me. I had cigars with one of our long-term clients last week, and he was pivotal in telling myself as well as some of the other people at that cigar lounge of how critical Integris was to getting them through that challenge. It just so happened that another one of our customers, which is a mid-sized law firm, was also there and articulated the same thing. This was completely unplanned by myself, but it tells you that these were old school businesses when we got involved with them, and they had listened to our advice and executed on it to allow them to, when COVID happened, quickly change. Kris, any thoughts on business B before we hit business?
Yeah, business B, Anthony, is that business that the strategy is based on hope, right? So you just hope for the best. And you use the word reactive when you were talking about it. This is all about reactive. This is, I don't know what to expect today. I'm hoping that it's going to be okay. Frankly, I don't understand what I have, what I don't have, and how to manage the risk that my business has. Business B will experience downtime, will experience ransomware attacks and things of that nature, right? Because that's just going to happen. As soon as you get internet connected to your computers, your office networks, and things like that, you need to understand the risk that comes with that.
Absolutely. On business A, on the other hand, is the complete opposite, right? In the right direction. I'm going to talk you through how I think about this. So there's definitely lower risk, right? They're way more proactive. They're not behind on the 8 ball. They know what's coming and they know the investments they need to make to stay up to speed. When it comes to regulatory compliance, if they have to adhere to any of these compliance regulations or frameworks, they're ahead of the game, right? They've done this before. They're prepared. This doesn't take them 3 months of employee time to get this done, or they're not jumping through hoops or running through challenges just to comply with frameworks or answer third-party vendor risk assessments. They're used to it, they've done it, and they're confident in their answers. They have greater speed and efficiency. So I think about this in 2 frameworks. One is internal with your employees. What employee wants to come to an office or a job and the technology is lacking? And it's a struggle every single day just to do their standard work on the workstation or the programs that they have to utilize. Number 2 is for their clients. How do they better serve their clients and give them a better experience? They can do that through the right systems. Finally, is strategic growth. This is actually where I love to go with this conversation. I really don't like the fear mongering or the scare tactics that happens a lot in the insurance or cybersecurity world. What I like to talk about a lot here is that growth mindset of, if I invest in these things, I can comply with a framework. And then I can use that framework to go get myself new business, or to show my operational maturity to the marketplace, or better compete with competitors that are larger than me for the same type of business. We have 2 really good use cases. I'll touch on one of them. I think it was Tennessee or Georgia, somewhere in that region, where we had a 15-person law firm that heavily invested in what we call vCISO services and the solutions that go along with that, because they are in a specific piece of law that they needed to compete with mid-sized regional to national law firms. And they felt themselves getting behind, and they wanted to understand, if they invested in these things, could they use that to their advantage? And the answer is yes. So now they're competing with firms 3 to 4 times their size and winning the business, because they're able to use this as a story to tell about how serious they are. It's the same thing that Integris does. We invest tens of thousands of dollars year in and year out to get our SOC 2 Type 2 and just take ourselves to the next level. And there's a lot of financial institutions that utilize that as the gating criteria on whether you can even talk to them. And because we've done that, we're using this to our advantage. And finally, the last point on here is that well-planned or optimized tech budget. My favorite type of individual to engage with in an organization is the financial individual. So that could be a controller, it could be a CFO. And the reason for that is they're not scared to spend money. They just want it to be predictable, and they want to know how much. And this framework allows them to understand that to a T. And instead of all of a sudden, like I mentioned before, having to invest $100,000 that they didn't know about, they'd rather invest $10,000 a year for 10 years. So when you get to business A, you're optimized, you know what's coming, and you're on the path. You can quickly pivot if something comes up, and you're confident. I think that's my number one thing. Kris, anything on business A?
I think you mentioned everything that I would say. One thing to add is that definitely way more proactive. That being said, not 100% bulletproof. Everything that we're going to be going through on our next slide, it's best practices, is the controls that we want you to have, that you should consider, but it's not going to make you 100% immune to what's out there.
Awesome. So our first poll of the day, to make sure you guys are still paying attention and breathing over there, is, do you think you're currently employing foundational practices at your business? Obviously, we haven't educated you on those yet, but we're wondering what your initial thoughts are. We got the poll over here on the right showing up on our screen. Ooh, yeses are definitely leading the way. No's are coming up here. Cool. I'll give it about 1 more minute. We'll close it off. All right, sounds good. So about 84% say yes. About 16% of our audience right now says no. We're going to get into those and make sure that if you said yes, you actually are. And if you said no, you're now educated on what you can do. So responsible IT architecture, in short, we call this RITA, R-I-T-A, a lot. This is the framework we've been mentioning, and we're going to run through it. Here's a visual. I'm not going to go through each one of these right on this screen because it'll take away from the presentation, but it's a really good visual to understand the concept and what we're thinking about here. The key point that Kris loves to make is that this isn't set in stone. This is constantly evolving. There could be a threat tomorrow that comes up and Kris gives me a call and says, Anthony, we got to add item number 10. But this, as we mentioned, last 12 years of being in this business, of the things that are consistently coming up that just in 2023, you need to make sure you have done or have an answer for, or finally have a plan for if you can't do it right this second. So with that, we're going to get into the first one. Kris, of the 1,000 environments that you've gone into, what is the standard you see when you start on the outside of the network with that firewall?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, and you know this really well. It's all over the place, right? But what's network firewall? Why is it important? Is the junction box that connects your office network to the Wild West of the internet. So we want to make sure that this is done. This is one of those things that just putting that in place and not paying attention to it probably is going to backfire at some point. So we want to make sure that we not only do this, we not only set up that firewall well, because by the way, buying expensive firewall is easy, but getting it set up right, that's the challenge. Not only that, when you set it up, you got to pay attention to it, because this is the buffer between the internet and your network. So everything is going through it. And if you pay attention to it, you can actually notice some patterns or some traffic, some interesting traffic that can prevent something bad from happening.
Absolutely. So a lot of things I've seen, not being in the technical seat, is a provider or an internal resource has given the organization the right advice. Buy XYZ firewall, the brand name firewall, the best in class firewall. And what Kris has always educated myself on and others is the firewall is only as good as the individual who set it up. And that's a scary statement, because a lot of people are entrusting in that person that gave them advice of, I took your recommendation and I executed, and they're entrusting that person to do the right thing. And when we've come in, all of the advanced security features have been turned off. Ports are wide open. And the reason for that is it takes a lot of work and effort and knowledge, experience, to be able to get those security settings and those ports to work with the overall environment, meaning user A needs to get to internet site Y, or that user needs to use this application. And those settings on the firewall can block that. So what ends up happening is the person doesn't have the experience and knowledge and just takes the easy route out and turns everything off. And all of a sudden you bought the most fancy firewall in the world and it's not really doing anything for you. I can tell you time and time again, that's what we see. Backup strategy. So this is, you got some really good thoughts on this, and then I'll work some people through the RPO and RTO and how I think about it.
Yeah, no, this is super important stuff, right? And there's so many just misunderstandings around, for example, the backup that comes or doesn't come with things like Office 365, right? So let's make things very clear. There's no backup that comes with Office 365, for example, out of the box. So we got to make sure that we'll put something in place to safeguard your emails, Teams messages, and things like that if you're in the Microsoft cloud. But not only that, we talk about the whole strategy. We're not just focusing on a system, we talk about the whole strategy. So having effective backup strategy means is that if all the layers of security that we're talking about right now, that seatbelt, right, just kind of get loose, you can recover from a disaster. So when we're talking about on-premises infrastructure, we want to make sure we're not only backing everything up to some sort of hard drive or appliance that you may have in the office, we want to ship that outside of the network. So that way, when there's some sort of ransomware attack, those backups are not being encrypted. So there's a whole list of best practices that we want to make sure that our clients have when it comes down to a strategy, but also just aligning the strategy with business objectives. So RTO and RPO, when recovery time objective, recovery point objective, there's a never ending, by the way, debate when we sit down in front of executives and say that, by the way, this is the backup that you have in place. And if we were to get you, if something major happens and we were to get you restore from that backup, it would take us 7 days to do it. Doesn't make sense for the business. And then we see literally just light bulbs. Really? No, that doesn't work for us. So we have to make sure that we not only have a backup that covers all the services that's supporting the business, but also expectations are being set with executives, also the clients of the client too, to make sure that the uptime and recovery is exactly what they expect.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna run through a couple of these things that I see or we try to educate folks on. So recovery point objective. quick, simple statement. If I go down, how much data will I lose? In most standard solutions, like when we ask the question, a lot of times we get, oh, I back up every day or every night, right? In that case, technically, if your backup runs at, say, 8 p.m. every single day, so it ran at 8 p.m. yesterday, and it's not going to run again until 8 p.m. today, that means you have the potential to lose 23 hours and 59 minutes worth of data. And Kris's point there is that's when he'll ask the team, is that okay? I can guarantee in today's world, most of the time, the answer to that is no. And what we see, and I'll get into RTO, but what we see is a complete misalignment between IT, that could be internal or external, and the executive leadership team. They're on two different pages. The executive team is thinking one thing, and the IT team knows it's something else. And they never talk about this strategy. Next one, recovery time objective. Simple statement. If I go down, how long is it going to take me to get back up and running? As Kris mentioned, when we look at these things, sometimes it's existent, sometimes there's non-existent systems in place. That could be upwards of 4, 7, or 2 weeks to get these things done. So that's strategically what we're looking at and educating people on. And when we have these conversations, I can guarantee you it's usually the first time that anybody has ever heard of these terms or has talked to them.
Here's the killer question, by the way, when it comes to the backup strategy too. When was the last time it was actually tested? And how do we know that it's actually working, right? I mean, Anthony, you're noting right now because like everybody's looking at each other like, oh yeah, it's been a while. So even if we make the promises within the organization that this is our RTO and RPO, and we believe that's really what it is, you never know if that's what it is until you test your backup strategy. So do a restore, have everybody connect and validate that this is really the data that they've been working on yesterday, and make sure that this is really what it is. That's a truly mature backup strategy when you can do things like that.
Yeah, the questions that we walk people through that Kris just mentioned is, are you doing backups? And the answer almost always is yes. And we never take yes at face value because of what Kris just mentioned. Because the next question is, have you tested those backups? As Kris mentioned, have you actually gone into the files that are getting backed up and proven that they are a good backup, that it's what you worked on yesterday? The file is real, it exists, and once you get into it, it has your data. That's question number 2. And question number 3 is, have you ever tried to restore from those backup files? And as Kris will tell you, there's probably a laundry list of stories around this. That final and third question is where reality comes into play. How many times have we gone into an environment after a disaster, a power outage, a hurricane, doesn't matter what it is, and they're like, we're doing backups. I know we have backups. And then we go and try an emergency situation to restore them from it, and it's a complete and utter failure because they've never tried that before. So you really, on this thing, it just can't be a simple, yes, I do backups. There's so much that goes into it. You have the 3 questions that I just asked, as well as the conversation around RPO and RTO. And by the way, I learned the RPO and RTO concept was from our founder, Rashad Bajwa. He sat me in front of a whiteboard and we went through RPO and RTO in our business, in the MSP business. And he asked me the questions of, if our email was to go down, how long do you think it could be down? If our phone system was going to go down, how long do you think it? And he started to walk through all of our major applications that we use every day to run our business. And the answer, surprisingly, is different for each one of them. In our world, our phones can't go down. We're a service-based business that responds to requests. So our RTO has got to be live. It's literally seconds, right? So that's how you want to think about this too. That takes it a next level deeper. But these concepts apply to every system that you have in your business. The final thing, and Kris mentioned this a little bit about having multiple storage or copies of your data. A lot of companies have gotten into trouble because they are doing backups, but the backup is located right next to the original data, right? It could be a physical copy right next to the data. And what happens there is you get in trouble when you no longer have access to that physical data. meaning the police shut down your building, or a fire and the fire department's now closed off the entire office complex, or a Hurricane Sandy happens in lower Manhattan and you just can't get to the building. Good luck trying to get that data. So you really want to think also about those types of things that come into play when you're thinking about your data and your backup strategy. I think we crushed this one pretty good, so we're going to go on to the next one. All right, sir, talk to us about internet security and content filtering.
Yeah, so sometimes you get this email and the email says, hey, go to this, click on this link and see what happens. So what do we want to do? We want to make sure that if you actually do get a really bad email, hopefully your anti-spam gateway is going to stop that. But if it didn't, when you click on that link in your office, in your organization, we want to make sure that it doesn't take you to the internet or the areas in the internet that you should not be going to. There's multiple systems out there, and some of them can obviously block the time wasters, like the Facebooks of the world and things like that. The way we look at it is that it's a business owner prerogative, and especially the policies that company may have in terms of blocking services like that or not. The way we like to think about this is that we just want to make sure that we allow the real Facebook to be accessible. Obviously, I'm using Facebook as an example. You should probably not be going to Facebook when you're at work, but and not some sort of malicious Facebook, right? So this is what we care about, because the ultimate approach to everything we're talking about here today is just it's a layered approach to our security. So again, we talked about the firewall. We just talked about the backup. Now we're talking about internet security, content filtering. We're going to be talking about a couple of things after that too. But these are all creating just the layers, and we want to make sure that if one of them fails, the other one kind of kicks in. Essentially, we want to make sure that you're not going to the places in the internet where you should not be going.
Absolutely. The concept here, like after firewall and backup, Kris, the thing I think about a lot too is now this remote work or hybrid work. And we went from this old concept of everyone being in an office and being protected behind a firewall and a controlled environment to now that endpoint, that workstation, laptop, desktop now exists in my home, in a hotel room, on vacation. And we've moved into this world where protecting the user and the endpoint needs to be extremely effective, because that thing exists anywhere and it's not, I'm safe behind this wall.
Really good point. And we can probably spend a couple of hours just talking about that. The shift that happens obviously from working in a physical office to working from home and whatever comes with that. But what you're talking about is really the firewall that we just talked about as the number one layer of responsible IT. You're not going to take this firewall home. So when you're taking your laptop home, you're taking your laptop home. And everything that it's on that laptop, whatever systems you can take with you, you're going to take them with you. That firewall stays in the office. So what we want to make sure is that all the systems, all the technologies that we're going to be going through today, they have to follow that user. So that way you can be productive and safe and secure from any place in the world that you might be doing the work for your organization. So the system that or the platform, the layer of security that we're debating here right now, the way we like to think about this is that it has to be portable. It has to be mobile. It has to follow you wherever you go. And the same thing again applies to all the other layers of security. So the content filtering or the internet security platform that we see on this slide, it has to follow you. Because again, you're not going to take that firewall, because the reason I'm dancing around this right now is that typically the content filtering, all good days, it was done by the firewall. Now we want to make sure that we transition that so it follows you wherever you go.
Absolutely. I like to talk about this too. Another layer to protect the user from themselves, right? Going to a malicious website that they just forgot or didn't think about or didn't check, or somebody got them really good, or that bad attachment or whatnot. Just a sandbox in which things can execute before something bad actually happens. Endpoint protection. So another layer that's built onto the actual endpoint, so it travels with you wherever you go. Kris, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing here in terms of the advancements of endpoint protection from legacy McAfee days to 2020.
Northern Rain, like all those things. And by the way, we still see those applications being used and installed and things like that. This is actually one of those areas where probably the most advancement has happened in terms of security. So you're going to hear terms like EDR, MDR, XDR, and things like that. All of that kind of ties to the endpoint protection at the end of the day. And it's a better antivirus. The simplest words are just better antivirus, right? The McAfee's of the world, like Anthony mentioned, and Norton's of the world, they used to be a definition-based antivirus systems, meaning that they have to that's why you have to pay all this money to download all the definitions on the computer. But those definitions are just patterns, things that people or analysts in the labs discover that if you get this file on the computer, this is a bad thing, it's considered a virus. What has been proven over the last couple of years is that that's just not good enough anymore. The bad guys are getting more sophisticated and they find a way, or frankly, quicker than the people in the lab coming up with those definitions. So what has happened in this industry is that, and by the way, huge involvement of AI, artificial intelligence as well, just observing and just monitoring the behavior of the user and trying to rationalize if the actions that are being taken on a computer are good or bad. If they are bad, even though I don't have definitions and I'm the antivirus software, I can help or I can prevent some damage from happening. And again, that's another platform, that's another layer of security that travels with you. You have these installed in the computer. It keeps an eye on everything that you're doing, how you're working, how you're interacting with your system, and will take an action if there is something considered bad happening.
Yeah, I like the way Kris explains it on the traditional versus behavior based. That's how I think through it a lot. The traditional meaning I needed to know the malicious code, and then I sent that through my system, told you to update it, and we were good to go. But that could take days to weeks at a time to learn about it, implement it at the vendor, and then eventually get it to the user. And by the way, the user isn't going to update their computer because they're just going to keep hitting ignore. Then going to the behavior-based system of, hey, the system understands how Anthony works every single day, how many tabs I open up in my Chrome browser, how much downloads I do, how much uploads I do, just my overall activity. And if anything gets out of whack in terms of something going haywire there, it's picking up on that behavior. And Kris, maybe you could explain a little bit of what does it actually do in terms of once it picks up my behavior has changed and it wants to implement itself, what is it doing? Is it taking me off of the network?
It can do all of the above, right? So obviously the most dramatic action that the system can take can actually automatically disable your access to the internet. So you're becoming offline, the system can still communicate with the cloud platform, but yeah, we'll just stop all the malicious traffic that is getting to your machine. Perhaps somebody's controlling the computer, somebody's monitoring the computer and things like that. And obviously, yes, that can be false positive, but the amount of even false positives with these platforms that we see these days is dramatically less than it used to be. So it's extremely effective platform. It's something that we ask our clients to put on their machines in order for us to deliver the results that they expect.
Email security, you brought this up before, another layer here. How I like to quickly talk about this is, or what we get asked a lot is, hey, Microsoft or Google or these email platforms have these built-in security already with this. Like, why would I get a third party to come in and also do this? So explain to us there the concept of why it makes sense to bring an additional layer on a vendor that focuses on this into an.
Yeah, no, they all do. You're 100% right. Microsoft has something going on, by the way. It's not like it's horrible or anything like that. What we want to do, however, is that we're turning to the experts in this area. For example, for anti-spam, we go to the experts in anti-spam to help us managing that spam, right? That might be getting to your inbox. Same thing applies with the EDR endpoint protection that we just talked about. And the one thing that I want to actually highlight when we talk about those things, the engines behind all the layers of responsible IT were very carefully selected, meaning that we don't have the same engine or same vendor doing more than one layer at a time. So what we want to, again, we're turning to the experts. Like for anti-spam, we're going to have an engine that we believe it's the best in class to do something like that for us. For endpoint protection, that's going to be a completely different vendor, completely different engine that is doing things like this. So this is just the theme, the philosophy that we follow when we're building those frameworks. And again, ultimately just laying them on the top of each other.
Absolutely. So like on your Microsoft email, we want it going through another layer and vendor prior to getting to Microsoft's layer to be just in case if Microsoft doesn't catch it, we've given somebody else the chance to catch it before it hits your inbox. Multi-factor authentication. We could talk at length about this solution. Almost everybody has now experienced multi-factor, whether it's their personal banking or Facebook or any type of these programs now that almost all of them requirement for a good reason, as we do. The number one complaint we get here is about the utilization of it and the clunkiness of it from the past. I remember my first job, I got the physical tokens, I had to enter in the code, and half of the time never worked. It ran out of battery, and I can completely understand that complaint. However, times have changed. These solutions have gotten way better, and the user experience is phenomenal now. The one thing I would say here is it's got to start at the executive level. We can't have, and Kris and I have had this multiple times. Kris, I don't know if you remember this. It was an internal IT individual and the CFO, and we did our assessment and we slid across the CFO's password on a piece of paper. And about 6 months prior, he had denied multi-factor authentication getting implemented. That day when we sat there and slid that paper across, his face said it all. And within a week, multi-factor was across the entire environment. That's the specific reason for this.
Username and passwords are just so easy to get these days, and they cost pennies on the dark web, right? So by the way, dark web scans and research of that network is part of our assessment process that Anthony will be talking about in a second as well. But yeah, username and password not good enough. Again, I think everybody heard about multi-factor authentication. To your point, almost every single system, including your Gmails of the world and things like that, will prompt you to set something like that up. But yeah, this is something that you need to have on the top of username and password. That's just way too easy these days.
Absolutely. Looks like Charisse and Kelly, we got some questions for you. So we'll definitely make sure we answer those questions here. Just want to keep getting through these so we can educate everybody on all of the findings here. All right, next one, least privilege access. So we think about this in two different formats, probably a little bit more. The two that we're going to talk about today is local administrative rights and Active Directory. Real quickly, I'll handle the local admin. Kris will touch on the Active Directory. Local administrative rights. When we go into environments, at minimum 10% and as much as 100% of those environments have users, all users with local admin rights. That puts you and your entire organization at a complete risk, completely vulnerable. If one person does one thing wrong, that cyber threat actor has access to everything. They have the keys to the kingdom. Our statement here is Kris, our security team, our CEO, our CTO, they all know a little bit about cybersecurity and these best practices, and they don't have admin rights to their computers to do things. Standard question here is, I want to go download a program when I want to do it, or I want to go we do this deal with a lot of developers and people that are know a little too much to be too dangerous, right? Where they want to be able to make these changes to their stuff. The answer is separate and distinct.
Frankly, Anthony, you don't want to be that guy. Again, you don't want to be that guy who, God forbid, got something in the email, click on something on your computer. Just imagine this. The chief revenue officer of Integris infected the whole Integris by clicking on something. Do you want to be that guy? That's why when I was asked, hey, are you some sort of Mr. Special here? I'm like, hell no. Give me the basics. Frankly, I want to have the least risk on my hands. And obviously, that's the guideline that we follow here in Integris as well. And same we do with the client. The thing that we see, to Anthony's point, is that sometimes the CEOs, the leadership of the organizations, like, I don't want to be bothered. I want to be doing those things on my own. But it's really like, what's on the other side of this? What's at the other extreme of that spectrum? Again, you don't want to be that guy. Take the permissions away. That doesn't mean that you can't do anything on a computer. You're going to be able to do still a lot of things, like frankly, everything that you have to do in order to do your job. We just want to make sure that if you get something malicious on your computer, that code has a minimal impact on everything inside of the computer. That's it.
And Kris, touch on the Active Directory when we go in there and evaluate that and just access for all people to all.
Sure. And so this is just, by the way, this is almost like epidemic these days, because it's very common. For example, even sometimes I'm going to use, just to get a point across, let's say there's a receptionist sitting at the front desk. And when we start just going on the computer, open Windows Explorer, File Explorer, and things like that, start navigating through the network, we can actually access, for example, QuickBooks files or things like that from that computer when we're logged in as this individual who typically should not have access to our financial data or something like this. So this is a least privilege rule, meaning that we would rather just put a permissions in place and have somebody come up and be like, hey, I need access to this. Then at least we can have a conversation and say that, why do you need access to that? Oh, that's right. Let's get it through a proper approval process. Let's make sure that everybody understands that this person has access to that, because it's important. It's important to make sure that there's some segmentation for the data. And not only that, Anthony, we're talking about this when we're chatting about the firewall. In order to make things work, it's super easy to just open all the ports and firewall rules, and then everything is flowing, everything is great. One thing that we see a lot still happening within things like Active Directory is that make somebody domain admin. Domain admin is a security group. It gives you all kinds of permissions on a network. And guess what? Everything works. Everything works on a computer. You can log in everywhere. You can do all those things. But then again, you can be that guy. If something major happens, if you get this bad attachment in the email, you double click on it, you open that macro from Excel, we need to brace for impact at that point. So again, it's best not to have that. Obviously, you need to have access to this. You need to have people who have access to this so they can help if something happens. But bottom line is we need to fine tune your systems to make sure that you can do your day-to-day tasks so your productivity is not impacted. But at the same time, you don't have all the keys to the castle.
Absolutely. I think the first part of our conversation on this one was external and why you want to limit access to things. And the second part of this conversation was internal, right? You have a rogue employee and they have the keys to the kingdom. A lot of things can be done without anybody coming in from the outside. Patching. We'll hit this one pretty quick. That update, the blue screen of death, or whatever people call it, or the alert that you get and you hit ignore 75 times and never update your computer or restart it or turn it off. We like to call that free security, right? That's Windows, Adobe, Java, constantly saying, hey, we know about these known vulnerabilities. We've been made aware of them. We have a fix. It's called a patch. Let's go implement it. The only way we can implement it, though, is by you accepting that update and patching it. So, Kris, what do we typically see from organizations on an effective patching schedule or a non-existent patching schedule?
Yeah, believe it or not, guys, there's so many systems that we come across that have not been patched. There's systems that we're coming across that, frankly, cannot be patched anymore because they just end of life, right? That's a separate conversation to have. But I love the term free security. This is something that you just got to stay on top of that. And a lot of vulnerabilities just go away, because if you read all the press releases or articles about this is the vulnerability that just came out, typically the recommended action to be taking is that you have to install the latest firmware, latest patch, latest whatever. Staying on top of that on a regular basis, but not being silly about it. Meaning that you have to really understand the environment. You have to understand what you have and what can be broken if you install the patches that are not tested. So the mature patching process comes with testing, deploying that to a machine or two, making sure that everything is working well, and then deploying that to the entire organization. But number one thing is doing that reliably. Staying on top of that process every month, every 2 weeks, every day, whatever the cadence might be. It's a process, a procedure, but the actual product that gets the magic happen, it's actually free.
Couldn't have said it better. And I believe our final one on here is up-to-date software and hardware. We go into environments and you have servers from 2003 or 2008. As Kris mentioned, there's two terms out there, end of life and end of support, which I know our team is writing up a document on right now to help understand the difference on those two items. But basically, at the end of the day, the manufacturer, whether it's a software system or a hardware system, is stating, we're no longer going to support this. We're no longer going to release patches, as Kris just mentioned, and it's completely end of life. So if you want to continue to implement this solution in your environment, you're taking all of the risk on that. And that's a terrible state to be. There are some times where outdated systems to run a manufacturing business were built on a Server 2008 operating system, and there's reasons for it. When that exists, we do our certain processes to put in a box around that environment, disconnect it from the internet, whatever we can do, because we understand that you still have a business to run. But at the end of the day, if there is not what's called a hardware lifecycle management program in place for not only servers, switches, firewalls, but also all those computers that are in your environment, you are definitely behind the 8 ball. And this is where we'll typically see some of the biggest spend to get caught up to. So anyway, that's what I have on that one. Kris, any last points on that before we get into the final?
The biggest challenge that really the IT departments have that we see every single day is staying on top of that. So how do I know that I have Windows Server 2012, for example, that is getting end of life later this year, right? How do I remember about those things? How do I track those things? How do I know that there is a Cisco operating system that it's getting end of life or something like that? The whole switch might be actually totally fine with a firewall, but that firmware it's something that needs to be changed. So Integris's managed services, we stay on the top of that for all of our clients. We work with our clients. We discuss this in our SBRs and QBRs and things like that to make sure that we get ahead of those things. And if we cannot transition from that system, because to Anthony's point, let's say there's a sub-old ERP system that we still need to keep around for reference purposes, or some accounting system, something like that, there is a way to make it safe and limit the impact, potential impact if something that happened, right? But this is all about awareness and again, process and just strategy to stay on top of that.
Awesome. So the next question we typically get is like, how do I even know where I stand against that framework or any other gaps that exist in my environment? So the Integris team is built out to provide on-site and virtual assessments. Here's a sample statement of work that we wanted to provide all of you. You can reach out to us directly and our local regions will engage with you. But the standard statement of work here is up to a full day on-site or virtual to evaluate everything that we just talked about and many additional layers that we didn't get to today or that aren't covered under that framework. We also provide, as I mentioned, dark web scanning. That's when I slid the password across to the CFO. We can tell you what of your user credentials are actually out there and on the dark web. The deliverable, we give you a formalized deliverable here that is going to list all of the gaps in your current state, how we would potentially solve those gaps, estimated budgeting, so you have that technology roadmap and budget for the future, and also business impact. So Kris and I like to touch a lot on the business impact of these results and how long you potentially would be down or the nature of the event that could occur and the impact of that event. So that our whole team across the US is built out to deliver on this. If you really want to understand where you stand on that framework we just walked through and any other gaps that may exist in your current environment, or you don't have a strategy or a focus going forward, we can help you with that. Final poll of today before we get into Q&A, and I know we're running up on time. I'm sure Kris and I will stay a little bit later here to answer any questions and keep the discussion going. But if Carl could launch that poll, just let us know if you're interested in learning more about the responsible IT architecture and having a little one-to-one or deeper conversation about that. Awesome. All right. So while they're answering that poll, Kris, it looks like I can take a look at the chat. Let's start with Sharice here. Sharice says, what are some of the email security vendors? Does this include Proofpoint?
Yeah, that's one of the engines that Integris supports. There's plenty of them these days, right? But it's all about picking something and getting really good at it. Proofpoint is technology of choice for Integris, and we know how to create exceptional results using that engine.
When you ask Integris folks about specific vendors, we're going to tell you it's all about getting really good and being able to stand behind the deliverable. Very similar to how I talked about the firewall is only as good as the person who sets it up. That's basically where we've learned our lessons, is let's get our team really good at delivering the results where our clients are expecting, and let's not worry too much about the vendor in the background. Kelly, does Integris still support or offer know-before product to customers?
My answer is that know before is definitely not our favorite. We have learned how to create better results to our clients using some other platforms, but if know before is something that you need help with, we can definitely help.
Perfect. Next one on here was Cindy. Why are different vendors important? For instance, if Firewall and EDR is the same vendor, is that okay? Good question. Kris answered this. I'll take a first shot at this. Cindy, the basic answer for us is if you have multiple layers with the same vendor, the chance that they miss a known vulnerability or a vulnerability in general, they're going to miss that on all three layers. So the way we want to take a look at that is if they miss it, if vendor A misses it on this layer, our hope is that vendor B will get it on this layer. And if they miss it, vendor C gets it here. So that's the reason that Kris and his team have designed those layers, not only with different layers and solutions, but also different vendors. We don't want to put our clients or ourselves, all our eggs in one basket per se. And a lot of times you'll see that in these breaches or these PR releases on the breaches that happen out there, one vendor was specifically targeted. And that's why we layer vendors in there, because if one vendor has a vulnerability, we can back in that or protect ourselves with other vendors. Integris manages our IT. We are in good hands. Thank you, Amra. I read that. I didn't know what I was going to get into as I got through that. Thank you so much for that. A couple questions on this other platform here. I just hit the question mark. This one is from Albert. How does your work interface with our account managers? Not sure if I am using the right position description. Yeah, Albert, I may need a little more details there. If you could provide it, I'd be happy to get after it. Eric, will the presentation be available from our CSMs? Absolutely. Cindy's question we answered. Kelly we answered. And Sharice we answered. All right. Christopher, thank you very much, man. Our first go at responsible IT architecture and laying out this framework for everybody here. I am going to go to the last slide here. That was the Integris no-nonsense approach to foundational IT best practices. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it. Provide our team with feedback on this. If you'd like us to go deeper on any of these topics or go into additional layers, we'd be happy to do so. With that, I'll see you all.
Thank you guys. Thanks.
Bye now.